Good afternoon, all. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this great conversation that we're anticipating. We'll give just a couple of minutes for those to come in from the waiting room, and then we'll be getting started in just shortly. In the meantime, I'd like to encourage you all, if you don't know where it is, to make sure that you pull up that chat box button down at the bottom. We hope to have a lot of engagement and conversation, so please feel free to use the chat box in order to participate.
Also, if you find yourself being muted, that is me. So just please mute yourself when you get into the audio.
All right, it's 1:01 and we have a great conversation planned, so I'd like to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Shalak Richards. I am Assistant Dean of Student Life, Diversity, and Belonging here at Pepperdine Caruso Law, and it is my pleasure with this office to bring you the second in our Reimagining Justice series. Last month, we discussed Just Mercy and had a great conversation around the criminal justice system. And this month, we are so pleased to discuss the life and legacy of Congressman John Lewis and the future of voting rights. Our featured panelists for this conversation are Cooper McHadden, who's in the JD class of 2022, and president of the Pepperdine Law chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. James Slattery, who is an alum, JD 2005, and works with the Texas Civil Rights Project, and Cicely Simpson, class of 2001, who is founder and principal at Summit Consulting. And so thank you all so much for joining us. I hope you are able to take the time to listen to the podcast, the New York Times Daily podcast on the life of John Lewis. I'm sorry, I forgot one person. I'd like to make sure to introduce to you Jessie Fay, who's Director of Alumni Relations and Employer Engagement here at the School of Law and will be co-moderator today. I'd also like to take a moment and thank all of our faculty, our staff, our alumni, our students, including Dean of the Law School, Paul Karen, who are joining us for this. We want to have a great conversation. We have some prepared questions for our panelists, but I'd like to thank you all so much for being here and for hopefully listening to that and coming with your thoughts, your questions, your conversation points. So please use the chat box to engage. If you have a question and you're brave and confident enough, maybe it's the students, to unmute yourselves and ask your question live, please do that as well. But we're going to be paying attention to both of those. So to start off, I'd like to ask each of our panelists in turn to just maybe speak for a moment or two about some of the work they do around voting rights and where they see the legacy of John Lewis. And I'll start with Cooper.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'm a 2L at the law school and president of National Lawyers Guild. My interest in voting rights kind of began while at UCLA when I got to see John Lewis speak to the school. He is a powerful individual in person, and his voice carries with such integrity and joy for what we can be, and that really inspired me to dig deeper in my studies. I minored in history and was able to take a class after seeing John Lewis speak with one of his mentors, Reverend James Lawson, who was talked about in the podcast as well as one of the kind of teachers of the civil rights movement. And I was able to take a class with him at UCLA, and he helped inspire me as well. And then my history minor kind of focused on scholarship around white allies in the Black Power movement and how we can do our part in support without like taking the light away from those who deserve the focus and attention. After graduating UCLA, I spent a year before law school simultaneously interning with Senator Harris's office and teaching a class at a local charter school to middle school students, actually on the life of John Lewis and on how they can be involved in peaceful protest. And then, now here at Pepperdine, I'm president of the National Lawyers Guild, and we're a progressive activist organization with primary goals this semester in getting the vote out. So I'm really excited to engage in this conversation today.
Thank you, Cooper. Cicely?
Sure. So good afternoon. Good to be with everyone. So I guess my interest in voting rights has been longstanding. I'm one of those kids who worked at the polls even when I was a young kid, holding signs and being a poll worker. And to this day, my mother does not miss an election. So it is sort of ingrained in our family that we are at the polls, we're working, and we're always ever present in our community back in Tennessee when it comes to voting. But my interest in John Lewis's life and obviously his legacy for voting rights stems from the fact that I worked on Capitol Hill. I was very blessed to have worked on Capitol Hill in the early 2000s when the giants, of Congress like John Lewis and Senator Kennedy and so many others served on Capitol Hill. And so I've worked with Mr. Lewis, had the very good fortune of knowing him, of knowing his amazing staff, both while I was on Capitol Hill, but also after I left Capitol Hill and started lobbying and in the consulting world. So I longstanding friendship, longstanding admiration, and looking forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. And James?
Hi, right now I'm a senior staff attorney at the Texas Civil Rights Project, but before that, I really went to law school because, I think I wanted to work in public service and politics and civil rights, but it took me kind of a very long time to know, like, well, what is that in reality? Like, how does one do those things? And after doing private practice for a while in DC for one of the big law firms there, I just went to go work for free for the Obama campaign in 2012, doing a bunch of different legal things. But what I think sort of connected me to now the field of voting rights is that we prepared for possible recounts after the election, which I guess we didn't know we were going to win in a relative landslide. And so the prospect of 2000 was still in the back of everyone's minds. And so in order to prepare for that, it required me and the other people on staff to come to know a lot about how election administration works and frankly, how it doesn't work in a lot of places in this country. And so in preparing to protect people's right to vote after the election, I sort of fell into the progressive voting rights space just as the Voting Rights Act, the accomplishment that John Lewis is best known for was coming under attack and had in fact been essentially stripped away by the Supreme Court in the Shelby County decision. And basically ever since then, whether it's through a partisan campaign or at my current nonpartisan organization, trying to undo the damage of the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County and trying to protect the right to vote while we await, hopefully, Congress restoring that sometime soon.
Thanks, James. And I think that gives us a great segue to the first of our prepared questions, although I've seen at least one in the chat, and I encourage you all to use the chat box and engage in this conversation. But, many argue and march right now, James, you spoke to your work in this even, that voting rights have regressed from where they were 55 years ago when the VRA was enacted. And talk about the Supreme Court decision in Shelby County v. Holder, and I'll actually drop a link to that decision in the chat here so that you all can take your time later as good law students and law adjacent people to read the Supreme Court opinion in your own time. But what does that decision mean for the impact on the voting rights landscape? And to give a little context, that decision in 2013 was a 5-4 vote down along ideological lines that some would say gutted the Voting Rights Act. And Democrats in Congress are now advocating to rename and revitalize it, as James mentioned, to the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, something that Vice President Biden has stated he would sign into law were he elected president. Not to go into the political sphere too much, but what does this legislation mean for the holding that came down in Shelby County? And do you think that would still be ripe for SCOTUS gutting? James or Cooper or Cicely, any of your thoughts?
James, you guys.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think the impact of Shelby County was absolutely devastating. And so I think to understand why and what the new Voting Rights Act might do if it's passed is, I think you can view the history of voting rights in the US in 3 periods since the Civil War. One is from 1876 until 1965, you had the former Confederates come back into power in a number of states. And they set about this project of making sure that only certain white men could vote in this country. And so they established this architecture of suppression. And they couldn't just do it quite openly because the 14th and 15th Amendments were there, but they established a series of administrative steps that were selectively enforced against people of color and women to keep them from voting. Specifically, you have things like the poll tax, literacy tests. Texas's contribution to innovating in voter suppression is the white primary, which allowed only white people to vote in the Democratic primary here in Texas, which Texas was a one-party Democratic state for much of its history, which meant that even if you could vote in the general election, the elected offices were basically chosen in the primary. And people fought back against that for decades and, repealed it one by one, the 24th Amendment getting rid of the poll tax. The Supreme Court had to strike down the white primary twice because when they struck it down the first time, Texas went back and tried it again a different way. And then it took 15 more years for the Supreme Court to strike it down again. And that all kind of culminated in the Voting Rights Act, which basically said that if you are one of these places that had this history of suppressing the right to vote, you could not change your state election laws without getting approval first or getting them pre-cleared by the Justice Department. Voting Rights Act did a bunch of other things, but when we get to Shelby County, this is the part that's important. And for about nearly 50 years, from 65 to 2013, it did not create a utopia, but it did put a lid on this voter suppression. And here in Texas, you would see the state kept trying to suppress the right to vote, but the federal courts and the executive branch were able to put a lid on it. So for instance, in every redistricting cycle since the Voting Rights Act, at least one federal court has struck down the state's maps because they were racist. They were meant to amplify the power of white people over people of color. Also, Prairie View A&M University here in Texas, kind of in East Texas, it's an historically black college. So the students are African American, but the surrounding population is white. And the white residents and white county government, especially in the 1970s, kept putting all kinds of property tests on who had the right to vote in order to keep those students from voting. But again, the judiciary is able to stop it. When you get to 2013, though, it starts the third and the current era that I think we're in, which is the Supreme Court struck down the pre-clearance mechanism, stating that, well, voter suppression and racism, it happened in the past, but it's been 50 years now. We shouldn't keep punishing states for the mistakes that their ancestors made. So Congress is more than free to come up with a new coverage formula for which states are subject to pre-clearance, but until they do, the pre-clearance provision is null and void. And, you know, it I think intentionally ignored the fact that Congress can't pass anything at the moment. So it effectively struck down the Voting Rights Act. And what we have seen is the lid came off, and you have all these voter ID laws now being implemented, which are extremely strict and have no correlation to fighting voter fraud. You have a mass wave of polling place closures across the country. And you have all these other barriers on the right to vote being passed state by state and being implemented right away, because the federal government now has no mechanism to require pre-approval first. And so that's kind of, I think, what the Voting Rights Act in general meant and what Shelby County did to it. And now the prospect of restoring that, the Voting Rights Act, and restoring that lid to make sure that in this new decade, we don't have these things continue.
Thanks, James. That was incredibly comprehensive and helpful, I think, for all of us. But Cecily or Cooper, do you have anything to add?
Cooper?
I mean, that was very comprehensive and really enlightening for me, even because I've read up on it, but to have it portrayed in that light was really fascinating. I mean, I'd also like to add maybe too on instances of voter suppression that are being done all over the country right now. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to this in the discussion, but between the post office and everything that's going on with that right now, and I mean, to me, the election in Georgia in the midterms was just an atrocity. And I think that's always worth talking about in discussions like this as well. And I think a lot of the abuses that are being done around voting rights centralize in those two particular things at the moment.
Cecily, anything?
I will echo my colleagues and leave it at that. How's that?
I think that's great. Thank you. I want to pull one of the questions from the chat, which maybe Cecily will be directed more to you because you were fortunate enough to work with Congressman Lewis, to interact with him. It's around his faith and whether or not, particularly I think because, you know, Pepperdine is a faith-based institution, so it's of particular interest, whether or not he demonstrated any faith practices, you know, personally or with his staff that would have shown how that would have fueled his pursuit of what we call good trouble, right? And how you may have seen his faith reflected in his life and reflected in the fights that he chose to take on.
Absolutely, that's a great question. I've observed Mr. Lewis and his staff, obviously, in a number of different instances, having worked in Congress for about 6 or 7 years. You know, the one thing about Mr. Lewis, you know, even when you come to Congress, and certainly when he was serving, you knew that he was different, right? You knew that his faith guided him. He was very open about that. I encourage you to look at some of his floor speeches, even one of the last ones he made in December of 2019, where he talks about his faith, where he talks about being on the right side of history, where he talks about what guides him every day in his work. And so, yes, his faith practices were very evident. And even the new book that came out yesterday or Tuesday about His Truth is Marching On, he talks a lot about his faith and how his faith has guided his work. I saw it played out it was very palpable. I'll just use one example, one quick story, and I won't keep you. But in 2007, when I worked for the congressman from Nashville, Congressman Jim Cooper, we were fighting to keep HBCUs from being closed. If you go back and Google what was happening at that time, historically Black colleges and universities were literally closing their doors for lack of funding. There was a lot of things that went into that, but Nashville is the home to several HBCUs, including the American Baptist College, of which Mr. Lewis attended when he was in school, and certainly some of his fight for civil rights started in Nashville. And so Congressman Cooper was one who stepped up in the Congress and said, look, we have to support, we have to, you know, protect these HBCUs. I got to tell you, a lot of people didn't join that fight, even members of Congress who actually represented and went to HBCUs, sort of left us hanging in that process, right? So we were literally fighting to keep these groups open, these colleges open, with not a lot of support, even from members of Congress who you thought would have been natural allies. So as we were preparing for a floor fight, trying to get an amendment passed that would restore this funding to the Higher Education Act, you never know who's going to be on your side. But when you know you have John Lewis who steps up and says, I'm with you, what do we need to do? When him and his staff expressed their support, you sort of breathe a sigh of relief because we knew others would follow him. He is such, you know, he was such a giant of the Congress. And when Nancy Pelosi calls him the conscience of the Congress, that's exactly right. we knew that once we had Mr. Lewis's support and his staff support, and he says, what do you need us to do? We knew at that point we were ready for a floor fight, and we dare anybody to really vote against, right, John Lewis, when it comes to, such issues as HBCU funding. So I will tell you, he led in a moment where we really needed him to lead, and he helped us in a critical fight that I think really set a pivotal stage for the future of HBCU. So I've seen it up close and personal, but also observed it like you all have observed it, just in awe of being in the Congress with him and his team.
On a personal note, I'll say I remember that fight. I'm a graduate of an HBCU, and so we were called upon as alumni to participate in that fight as well. And so thank you for your hard work with all of that. There's a question in the chat that I think, is directed a little bit towards James, but Cooper, I'd be interested on what you and Pepperdine NLG may be doing with this as well. Given the many challenges that you identify to voting rights, particularly right now, what strategies can those in attendance use to minimize barriers to voting right now?
James, you want to tackle that first, and then I'll jump in at the end?
Yeah, so I guess I'll build from some of the things that we are doing here in Texas now. So I think a couple of things that we are trying to do here, just kind of in general, is we really need to be communicating pro-voter values at every opportunity. So here in Texas, we were involved in the 2019 legislative session here, and it was my first time ever doing legislative work. And so I sat in on a lot of hearings on election bills and took in the air. And one thing that I saw is that, at least here in Texas, although I think it's true more broadly, that those who are working against the right to vote are always there. They are at every forum that they can to spread their message that voter fraud is the real threat to democracy. And therefore, when any election measure is being considered, the effect on voter fraud is the primary consideration. And, it's a free society. They can make that argument if they want. But much more rarely did I hear anybody communicating a basic pro-voter values message, that our democracy is built on the idea that everyone should have a say in electing their officials, that it is the responsibility of government to make voting as easy and accessible as possible, and that we are all stronger as a democracy when more people participate. And I think, I think people who support civil rights inherently believe that, but I think it's a thing we need to say out loud at every opportunity to sort of build the intellectual capital to then say, okay, we need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act because of these values that we are also communicating. I think the other thing that comes to mind right away, and it's a thing that my organization does a lot of, is, the passing this new Voting Rights Act would be just an enormously beneficial accomplishment. Just I cannot overstate how important it would be, but it's not the end of it, right? Because there's only so much the federal government can do, because most responsibility for elections is at the state level. And so engaging with your own state and even county officials, because really the election is administered by however many counties there are in the country. And so advocating at those lower levels for positive election measures is really critical.
Yeah, I might jump
Absolutely.
in.
Oh,
Then I'll jump in.
okay, go ahead.
No.
Okay, I was going to say 2 prongs. One, I think as law students, we have an extra obligation to really get engaged ourselves in the election and in voter protection, because we are, inherently engaged in these historical conversations every day that have such a large impact on the problems of today. And if I may just do a brief backdoor thing we should be advocating for, I think, for enhanced, or expanded voting rights, is when you're talking about who is marginalized and who isn't able to exercise their right to vote, it's often communities of color. And one way we can pass more legislation to protect communities of color and get them the right to vote I think, is to advocate for more, DC statehood and Puerto Rico statehood. I think that having there are populations in those states that are, sorry, in those districts, territories, however you refer to them, that are larger than some states. And in both instances, that Puerto Rico and DC have are a majority population of color. And I think having that electorate elect more individuals to Congress and to the Senate in particular would dramatically change what the laws in this country look like. And yeah, I'll seek to go ahead.
Cooper's bringing up a point that gets me on my soapbox, so I'm not going to go there. But in 2009, we actually tried to have a DC statehood that would have switched the DC representative for the Utah senator, and there would have been a one-on-one switch, and it got completely messed up in the process. So Cooper, you're bringing up a great point. We've been fighting that battle here in Congress for a while, but so I think your point is very well taken. But on the strategies piece, I just wanted to mention one piece of the equation. And I think something all of us can do when we're talking about voting is, message and messenger matter. And so what I mean by that is right now, I mean, listen, I scream at the television every time I hear somebody say mail fraud, or you start hearing, Washington speak. And it's like, no, you've got to tell people they're screwing up the mail so that you can't vote. Like the message piece gets so lost because we're trying to be very, whatever the, I don't know if it's politically correct, or we're trying to be very, astute in how we talk about these things, but people aren't paying attention. So literally when I get the question from my clients who are like, hey, like what's going on? Or, what's this deal with the post office? I'm like, look, you got to plan your vote. So where do you vote? You need to vote now. Can you vote now? When does early voting start, right? Don't rely on the mail. But if you need the mail, then here's what's going on that's going to make that even harder. I think really plain English, like a direct message is so missing right now on the vote, on the barriers to voting. And people are just tuning it out because they're like, yeah, whatever. And it's like, no, you need people to pay attention. So I think our message and our messengers really matter right now. And I'm not sure we've gotten it exactly right.
Cicely, if I could just retweet all of that, like I won't do it here, but I have an impression of a technocratic, like progressive, like think tanker of like how they talk about election administration. And I think like every word in the impression has at least 7 syllables in it. Like people, like we need to talk as like human, authentic beings, right? In a way that's accessible to people. And I think that that's a real challenge. Though one additional like strategy is building coalitions. So last year we had this really big, bad voter suppression bill going through the Texas legislature, and it did like 30 bad things, right? And it's like, how do you even communicate 30 bad things? But one thing that we did do is we took the bill apart and we were like, who is going to be hurt the most by each of these provisions? And then reached out to the communities affected by it. So for instance, a lot of the provisions in that bill would have made it harder for people to vote if they needed assistance, right? Like if they had a medical condition that made it hard for them to mark a ballot, or like they needed language translation. And so we were like, okay, who would be hurt the most by this? And right off the bat, we were like, people with disabilities who are often needing assistance while they vote, veterans who come back from war with these traumatic injuries that leave them partly disabled, and people who are not native English speakers. And reaching out to those organizations that represent those communities that may not have thought voting rights was their core mission, but making a case to them that this is a thing that's really going to impact your community, join us. And we did that with like other bits of the bill. And so the bigger your coalition is, the harder it is for the people in power to say no to you.
That's really interesting. And I think to what you're saying, James, on coalition building, and Cicely, what you were saying around message and messenger, and the messaging, one thing that springs to mind for me is the tendency, and I apologize to anyone else on the call, but the tendency in that first memo you write to include every big law word that you've learned in the first 3 weeks of law school. You guys know where I'm going with this, right? Cooper, I'm sure you remember that. And then having the really good professors, like I see one of them, Professor James, on this call, advise you to scale back, to use regular English, they tell you that the best oral advocates are the ones who can speak in a way that the people can understand and take to heart. And that really is what immediately came to mind. And I wonder if there's some sense of like the true academic that goes into this, you know, James, as you called it, the technocratic sort of progressive think tank, and never quite gets back to that place of scale it back and write it simpler and clearer. But to that, a question that is in the chat, and I think around that message and messaging is, what are the solutions to have a conversation that includes the pro-voter values, James, that you discussed, but also addresses the concerns that many feel are very legitimate around voter fraud, around, you know, what mail-in voting looks like, around what the post office may or may not be doing right now, and how to reach out across, I think, aisles and ideological lines to say that voting, regardless of who you're voting for, is what truly matters. Any thoughts on that? Maybe Cicely is our resident consultant. You can give us some a pro bono consultant advice on how to get the message that hits both sides really well.
It's a great question. I think when you're having conversations with people about voting, whether it's pro voter or the messaging with what's going on right now, I think you have to meet people where they are. And I think that is a very big piece of the equation that's missing right now, is you have to understand who your audience is, right? So let's say Dean Richards and I are having a conversation. You can't assume, right, where she is on this issue if she knows. I mean, let's be honest, guys, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and having problems with voting is just, people have fatigue right now in a way that is so palpable. And you see it, you hear it, and it's one of those where when you have one more conversation of one more thing they have to think about, it just, you know, you can sort of see people sometimes that I speak to are just like not following it. So I think the biggest piece for me, the biggest strategy and solution would be meet people where they are. Don't hit the one thing we always do, and James said it very well, we just come out swinging with our point of view. Here's what we think, here's where they're wrong, here's where the other side, you know, we just always want to be opinionated, and you see it in the cable news, you see it all over social media. But if you don't meet people where they are, your message just got lost and went in one ear and out the other, because they're already assuming that you're on this political piece, or they're already assuming that your conclusion is going to be a conclusion they're not interested in, as opposed to having a thoughtful conversation about where we are, what's wrong, how do we fix it, and then how do you move on from there. So that's sort of my initial solution, is meet people where they are and don't assume they are where you are.
Can I add a coda to that I think Congressman Lewis demonstrated so well, and I think it ties back to the faith piece, is maybe meet people with grace as well, right? It's so easy to assume truly bad intentions. And of course, we know the road to hell is paved with good intentions, so you can't rest everything on intent, but perhaps when we're meeting people where they are, we're meeting them with some grace in the moment, and assuming an honest interest in growth and in development and in protecting their rights. I don't know, maybe that's the preacher's kid in me that wants to go down that road. But in any case, there's a question here around the future of voting. And so much is becoming technological. And do we see advocating for more technology in voting as a positive, or would that be a hindrance to true voting abilities? Cooper, it looks like you're about to speak on this.
Yes. I know I'm very well versed in, I know Senator Harris's policy, and she is very, very against technological advancement in as far as in voting. Paper ballots, she believes, are critical to maintain a degree of election security and to ensure that that's not compromised, as well as also just voter access, because not everyone has access to the internet. But having everything on paper does add a degree of security to the process. And I know at least that she was very opposed to that idea. But I'm very curious for Cecily and James, what your thoughts are on that as well.
Go ahead, James. I'll jump in after you.
So as a honorary Texan, it's almost hard for me to answer, because as an example of how far behind we are in the state, we do not even have online voter registration. And that is an intentional choice by the people in power in Texas to make it harder to vote. And I'm not just making that up because I'm a crazy liberal. The last time this came up before the Texas legislature, I think it was in 2017, because it was such a painful experience for people in the state that they didn't even really try again in 2019. There was a hearing that was a circus, because those who are opposed to online voter registration actually made the case that the state should not have online voter registration because it would make it easier for people to register, which meant you would have a lot of people who are low propensity voters or really non-voters who would just sign up online because they're like, oh, in good intention, I'm going to register to vote, but then not vote. And that someone could commit voter fraud by essentially, I don't know, getting a mail ballot in their name or impersonating them at the polls. I mean, it's ludicrous. There's no evidence that that happens anywhere. But they made the case to the committee. And then one of the, and I have to say the party's name here because it's relevant, one of the GOP activists leading the opposition to online voter registration actually threatened the Republican members of the committee, basically saying, hey, look, we're watching you. We'll remember your vote come next time. And there's nothing those people are more fearful of than a primary challenger. So it's sort of like here in Texas, like we would just love to have the technology that you all have right now. But to be a little bit more serious, I mean, I think better technology would help. Here again in Texas, you may have heard that there was this issue in 2018 where votes for Beto O'Rourke were being changed to Ted Cruz. And that was because the machines were so old that they were using that little spin dial that the early iPods had, and people literally didn't know how to use the technology because it was so out of date. And that results from the chronic underinvestment in election machines and other infrastructure in the state, in the country, but especially in Texas. I think, talking about DC statehood, I think that we sometimes would like to think that there's like a technological fix that will always like solve our problems, right? And I don't think y'all mean that here. But I think while technological investments would be great, the thing is, the problem is really the structure of our like political system. The fact that we cannot update our election systems because our legislative system is so gridlocked, that we have a system that is gerrymandered at essentially every turn, right? Like the states are literally gerrymanders, and they amplify the power of certain populations over others. You have a Supreme Court whose population is basically reliant on who controls the Senate at any given time now. And so, look, Texas we are thirsty for like new technology, and it would certainly help. But I think the bigger problem is our political system has not been updated in 50 years since the 26th Amendment granted voting rights to 18-year-olds. And until those structures are fixed, things aren't going to, I don't know, they're not going to get much better, I think.
Can I jump in? Because I think that there's a question that Carlos Jimenez put in the chat that just ties to that so well on how to reach voters or non-voters, right, who are cynical about this system, cynical about the two-party vote. Maybe they voted and feel their vote didn't count, or they want a third-party option. As the resident proud Canadian on here, I will speak up so loudly for the parliamentary system, but please don't stone me out of the country just yet on that. But do you all, in all seriousness, maybe Cecily, especially because I know you've worked across, the parties, any thoughts on the viability of that and on reaching people who just frankly are, to James's point, maybe a little disgusted, a little frustrated with the system that's in front of them right now?
Wow, that's how much time do we have? I could go into
and do it all in 30 seconds, right?
Exactly. Yeah, get it done. Listen, it's a great question. There are a lot of people who are cynical about a two-party system. There are a lot of people who are cynical about a three-party system. So what I think the biggest piece of that in terms of reaching voters is, I think it's voter cynicism in general, right? So I just heard a lady on TV the other day who said, well, the polls in 2016 said Hillary Clinton was leading by like 20 points. So why waste my time and go vote? When you talk about the future of voting, you talk about two-party system, I think the cynicism of the American voter is the piece of the equation that spans across both parties, that spans across the future of voting, technology. I mean, I've worked on election security when I worked in Congress, and I know way more about election security systems and how they work and the antiquated nature that James talked about. I think until we get a baseline cybersecurity infrastructure in this country that can actually protect the technology in place, and I don't see us moving to, a technological based voting system because we have so many vulnerabilities. But I think that also feeds into the cynicism of the American voter. It's not only whether their vote counts, but it's like, well, if I do it, is it going to be done right? Is somebody going to mess it up? There's a lot, I think, to unpack in that question that Carlos is asking to really tie the future of voting to where we are in a two-party system. I don't see a three-party system anytime soon. Quite frankly, even the independents in Congress vote with Democrats. So even if you have a viable sort of third-party lane, they tend to pick sides because those are the two sides who are in charge. So unless there's like a serious breakthrough where there's palpable numbers that would count, I think I don't see a third-party system. You could argue, and I promise I will not go down this road, Dean Richards. I will just I'll throw it out there as the bomb, and I'll just let it hang out there in the air, and people can think about it. The real sort of middle lane here that people are looking for is currently occupied by the moderates in both parties, right? The people who want to bring both sides together to get things done. Well, they've been losing in Congress since 2010. So arguably the people who were the ones who are driving cybersecurity, election, changes, voter rights, the people who actually are the sensible middle are gone. And this election may wipe out the rest of them, at least in the Republican Party. That piece of the equation really factors into your two-party system, but the three-party piece as well, because it shows the lack of tolerance that we have for those middle centrist, get things done kind of people. That has not been a welcomed middle lane in Congress over the past few years. There's all kinds of reasons for that, but like I said, I'm going to throw that bomb out there and just let it hang, and people can hammer me on LinkedIn or Twitter or something later over that one.
No, can I agree with you, Cicely? I want to amplify that, and I'm going to be very, very dark for a few seconds, and then I'm going to try to bring some positivity back. But I think for a while, voting rights advocates have struggled with this question of how do we get voting rights to be bipartisan again? Because when the Voting Rights Act was last reauthorized, I believe it was unanimous.
It was.
Either in both houses or in one, but almost in the other. And George W. Bush signed a 25-year extension to the Voting Rights Act. So how do you get from there to 7 years later, a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court striking it down, and now there's no possibility that a Republican-controlled Congress will ever pass an extension. And, I think for the longest time, there's been this discussion, how do you appeal to the moderates? How do you appeal to the people on the other side? And I think the voting rights community has to really ask itself realistically at some point before too long whether that is possible or realistic. That American politics may have, over the course of the last 50 years, just polarized, right? And it's easy to see that with healthcare or abortion or LGBT rights. And we've kind of come to accept that, look, one party thinks this, the other party thinks that. But when it comes to voting rights, it may just be a fact now that is at the moment not fixable, that you have one side, one party that is pro-democracy and pro those values, and another that is authoritarian in nature. And what does that mean for democracy to have perhaps one member of this duopoly actually be opposed to democracy? I don't know. But I think you're right, Cicely, that the search for this moderate out there, every wave election, they've all been wiped out except for 5%. And then the next wave election, that 5% are all wiped out except for the 5% of that. And this is another wave election, and They may not be here anymore.
Well, and you're right. And I tell people, we talk about the presidential election, but when it comes to voting rights, I tell people the Senate is as important as the presidency. I mean, the Voting Rights Act has been sitting it's been sitting in the Senate, dwelling, and the Senate is not going to act on it. And that's not a partisan statement. So for those of you who have, either party leanings. You mean, James, you're right. I mean, the Senate is not going to act on that. So I tell people, if you want change, you have to vote for the senator you want this fall, in addition to the president you want, because the Senate is where all good things go to die right now. And literally the life and future of the Voting Rights Act is sitting in the Senate, and there's no action for the foreseeable future coming on that. So I think the way to change it, to your point, James, is really, I mean, you want to vote, you got to vote the Senate this fall. It's not just the presidency, it's the Senate as well. Otherwise, the Voting Rights Act will never move in Congress, to your right, for the foreseeable future.
And the optimism that I promised you that I forgot about, I can tie it back to, I think, the overall topic of John Lewis is that, you know, I think his life offers that optimism, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we look back at like the 50s and 60s and say, it's easy to say that like the civil rights movement was inevitable and that it would inevitably win. But oh my God, like they were going up against a white apartheid state that had been in power for 100 years. And the previous version of that had held people in slavery for over 200 years, right? And the idea that you could somehow just dismantle that in less than a lifetime. And I think that goes into the power of protest, right? So I've been thinking a lot about like the Edmund Pettus Bridge in recent months. And I think part of that has been spurred by the George Floyd protests and also Mr. Lewis's death. And I think that one thing that protest does is that it makes oppression that is otherwise invisible, quite visible and quite real, especially to the people who benefit from it, but who deep down are opposed to it. But their opposition to it is inactive because it's not really in their face, right? And so, you know, what John Lewis and those other protesters did during the 50s and 60s, most dramatically on that bridge, is that they made the evil of this system so visible that you cannot ignore it anymore. And it's not an accident that the Voting Rights Act passed shortly after that. And we're seeing this now with the George Floyd protests, where George Floyd was murdered in a very obvious way that you cannot ignore. And that triggered people's opposition to this evil, to the evil aspects of the system that killed him, that people were deep down opposed to, but it hadn't been activated yet. And so when you bring out the real human examples of this oppression, like we did with that bill last year, where part of what we did is we recruited as many people with disabilities as possible, and we sent them into the hearing room on that bill, and we had them testify one after the other. That is pretty powerful and compelling stuff. And so, you know, I think one lesson of Lewis's life is that this situation that we may be in the moment is not forever, that it can be overcome, and that there are tactics and strategies of protest that he lived that can be brought to bear.
Absolutely. And recognizing that we've got about, you know, maybe 10 minutes left, and I almost feel like next month, instead of having a new topic, there needs to be like a part B to voting rights, you know, and because there are questions in here about felony disenfranchisement, which is its whole other topic. We had prepared questions about the possibility of making, you know, Election Day a national holiday, which I know was raised last year even at an Election Day event that we held at the school. And I know Cooper and NLG have a whole slate of voting rights and elections events planned. And I want to give a plug for the school that we're going to be doing some voting registration work coming up. So I want to make sure all of our students across programming and across the university are registered to vote. But I want to turn to what might be a more, you know, like James said, ending on a moment of hope. I don't want to ignore or pretend to be ignorant to the moment that we find ourselves in. Kenosha, Wisconsin has been, you know, I maybe figuratively, if not literally, on fire for the past few days. I know many in the community, Black, white, Asian, Latino, across society, even the world, have hearts breaking for Jacob Blake's children who saw him shot in front of them, regardless of what the surrounding circumstances may be. So there are real hurt in our community right now. And I guess in the face of all of that, you know, Mr. Lewis, as you so aptly put, James, stood for hope, right? Stood for this idea of a man who, frankly, was older than my parents. The Voting Rights Act is younger than my parents. When I think about that, my mind is blown away. And A man who lived through all of that. And I heard someone say, I think it was even on that podcast, the reality that most of those civil rights icons did not live to see a full life. And there's such hope embodied in him. For you all, what does that phrase, the hope and the idea of making good trouble, what is that for you? Maybe in 30 seconds to a minute. How would you define your good trouble in this moment and what that hope could look like for moving forward? Cooper, I'll start with you. Cold call.
Good trouble is a powerful phrase because it means you have to put yourself out there and get to the actual work of making a difference. I mean, in John Lewis's life, he was arrested 45 times, 5 of those times while sitting in Congress. And it's, I mean, we may not all be in the position to get arrested 45 times in our lives, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be approaching with the same level of intensity and trying to do what we can. I mean, I think right now, any efforts that you can make as law students in the realm of voter protection is what is required, from ensuring that there's poll workers who are right now dramatically poll workers in the past are generally pretty old, and they cannot be in those positions right now because of the coronavirus. So ensuring that people are manning those polls, ensuring that people know how to fill out mail-in ballots and are not afraid of those ballots being tampered with or voter fraud issues or whatever that is those overwhelming concerns. We have to just address that head on and get engaged any way we can. And yes, if you're law students here at Pepperdine, NLG will be holding events on voting rights. So please engage with us and we'll get you involved.
Sorry, I was muted. James, what does good trouble mean to you?
So I want to reiterate the specific things that Cooper just said. Like, there's nothing more that you can do that's good for our democracy than to be a poll worker this year, other than voting itself. So, volunteer to be a poll worker, go vote. If you were in Texas, I would say become a volunteer deputy registrar. So that way you could register your fellow citizens, because we have that requirement in Texas too. But I would say, as a general matter, I think it means speaking out and being present when that is needed to confront injustice. And so the protests over police killings right now, like being a part of that and marching and speaking out about the value that we shouldn't have the state just being able to kill its own citizens without accountability. Also, I've been thinking about that phrase, good trouble, a lot this week, because we sent a letter to our governor here in Texas taking advantage of the recent Postal Service letter saying that they couldn't deliver mail-in ballots on time, and using that to put the spotlight on the governor and saying, hey, you say you have emergency authority under the coronavirus to rewrite election laws, which is another problem, but he says he has it. And so, okay, then you should use your executive powers to fix this problem or explain to the public why not. And we hope that he does it, but if he doesn't, we want to hold him accountable to the public and make that decision visible to them. So in thinking through our strategy on this, I sort of thought, well, what we're doing is we're being a pain in the ass to the people in power. And I think that is a part of being good trouble, is being a pain in the ass to people who wield great power and need to be held accountable to the public.
Thank you. Cicely.
Sure. So I've been thinking a lot about this as well. And I think the marching orders he left us with has really been on my heart since we learned of Mr. Lewis's passing. I mean, to lose John Lewis and C.T. Vivian on the same day within hours of each other, wow. I mean, it's weighed very heavy on my heart. And as I was sort of preparing for this week, I saw something on social media, and I had forgotten that this is the 65th anniversary of Emmett Till's murder. And that was a defining moment that Mr. Lewis has talked about throughout his life that really spurred him to action. And before he passed this year, he said, when asked, have we made progress? He said, absolutely. Look at my life. I've gone from, being a sharecropper's son and being, in the cotton fields of Alabama to Congress. Like, look at where I am. But he also said, but there's still more work to do. So I think when you talk about good trouble, and certainly if anybody's coming to the March on Washington tomorrow here, the 57th anniversary of the, I Have a Dream speech, then I think that's certainly one of the marching orders that Mr. Lewis left us with. But for me, Good Trouble is the ultimate marching orders that he left. And this quote, literally, I think about it every day, but he said, if not us, then who? If not now, then when? And so when you talk about voting rights, what do I do? How do I live that legacy? For me, that is a deeply personal, but also a collective call to action that he has now passed the torch. And if we don't do it, who will? And if we don't do it now, when will it happen?
Wow, thank you. Well, I want to say, and I see Cooper dropped the link in the chat. I would encourage everyone, if you haven't read it, to read that last opinion piece that Mr. Lewis wrote to be published after his death. And it's just so powerful and motivating, right? I want to thank you, Cecily. Thank you, James. Thank you, Cooper. We're ending a couple minutes early because Cooper has class at 2 and I will not get him in trouble with the dean on the call and have a reason to get anyone shut out. But I think, I'll speak to the fellow organizers, but I can see so much more here for conversation around voting rights to continue in this series next month. I want to I'm putting in the chat the link to, I think I spelled that right, law.pepperdine.edu/diversity. This conversation has been recorded and you give us about a week and we'll get this conversation up on that webpage, law.pepperdine.edu/diversity. And so you can listen to these calls to action, right? Register to vote, encourage the people around you to register to vote, mail in your ballot, drive it to the polling station, know for your state where you're located what it means to vote by mail-in. Register to be a poll worker if you don't have class that day, or get permission from your professors to miss that class. If you do, I'm not advocating for or against. And be graceful to the people around you, right? Think about your message and your messaging and your messenger. Let's be graceful. Let's reinvigorate coalition building. I don't want to accept James's premise that voting rights is partisan. It should be foundational to this great country. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you all so much for being here. Cecily, James, Cooper, for taking your time out to be part of this conversation. It's so appreciated. Have a wonderful and blessed day all.
Thank you.